I want to welcome everybody to this bridge event hosted by the REL Northeastern Islands and the English Language Learners Alliance. And I would like to introduce Dr. Maria Paz-Avery, who is our moderator today. Hello, MP.
Hey, Peter. Thanks a lot. Thanks for the wonderful introductions as you were waiting for everybody to get on and for our starting time. Good afternoon to everyone. As Peter said, my name is Maria Paz-Avery, and I'm the facilitator for the English Language Learners Research Alliance at the Regional Educational Laboratory for the Northeastern Islands. Welcome to all of you to this webinar entitled Multi-Tiered Systems of Support Towards a Culturally and Linguistically Appropriate Model for ELLs, hosted by our Alliance as part of our research agenda to use data and research to better understand the diversity of our ELL population and their equally diverse needs. We are very pleased to have with us today two national experts on multi-tiered systems of support who will speak to the use of response to intervention to meet the range of language and content learning needs of our ELL students. Our agenda for today is going to be as follows. After I get done with the welcome and introduction, we will have the first part of the presentation by Dr. Julie Esparza-Brown, who will be speaking on general guidelines for response to intervention for English language learners. Dr. Esparza-Brown is an assistant professor in the Special Education Department and director of the Bilingual Teacher Pathway Programs at Portland State University in Portland, Oregon, and has worked as a bilingual and special education teacher as well as a school psychologist. Dr. Esparza-Brown will present on the general guidelines of RTI for ELLs and will address many of the questions that I know you probably have in your minds as you're coming to this webinar. After Dr. Esparza-Brown's presentation, we will have a question and answer period that will be moderated by Dr. Carrie Parker, who is a researcher on the ELL Alliance. Dr. Parker does a lot of the work in studies and other projects that we do focusing on aspects of the research agenda that was established by a core planning group made up of state and district representatives from within our jurisdiction. Our second presenter today is Dr. Claudia Rinaldi. Dr. Rinaldi is currently the Assistant Director of the Urban Special Education Leadership Collaborative at EDC. She also works with school districts and schools on the implementation of response to intervention as a school-wide and systemic approach to providing solid core education for our ELL students, as well as Tier 2 and Tier 3 interventions that are tailored to the specific needs of individual students, in particular, again, our ELL students. Dr. Rinaldi will present case examples of how a culturally and linguistically appropriate RTI model has been implemented in two different systems. Once again, after Dr. Rinaldi finishes her presentation, we will have an opportunity for questions and answers that will be moderated by Dr. Parker. Finally, as you can see in our agenda, we will have a short wrap-up session during which we will ask you to complete a feedback survey form. That form is really very important to us as we report back to our funders, the Institute of Educational Services Research. I can't remember what they're called. Anyway, and so we really ask you to complete that feedback survey so that we can also improve other webinars that we do in the future. Just to review our event goals, we expect that by the end of this webinar, you will have a clear idea of how to develop a multi-tiered system of support that is culturally and linguistically appropriate for ELL students, how to plan for and deliver preventive assessment measures, collaborative structures, and data-informed problem-solving strategies, and finally, how to implement such a model with fidelity and integrity. That is an aspect that is really key to making sure that we provide quality education for our English language learners. Before we get started, I want to just go over very quickly what our format will be As I said, there will be 2 presentations. While the presentations are going on, you can submit your questions in the chat room. The chat room is to the left of the slideshow, as you can see, and you can enter your questions there. We will be monitoring the chat room very carefully so that we can pull out any clarifying questions that might need to be answered during the presentation. If we can answer them ourselves, we will do so. If we need to have clarification from either of our presenters, we will ask them to do so. However, we will be holding all the substantive questions until the question and answer period so that our presenters will have as much time to present their information. We have a lot of information, wonderful information that they will be presenting during this webinar. I should also mention that it's very likely that we will not be able to get through all of the questions that you post on the chat room, and that's one of the things that we provide as part of the supplementary material that Peter had mentioned earlier that will be available along with the archive. So any questions that are not answered during the webinar itself, we will be asking our presenters to develop short written answers to those questions, and those will be made available with the materials of the archive. So just before I turn this over to Dr. Esparza-Brown, who will be doing her presentation very shortly, we will be putting up a poll with a few questions just for us to get a sense of where you, the participants, are in terms of the implementation of RTI. So if we can move to the poll now and put it up on the screen, that would be great. So we'll take just a minute, so please answer the 3 questions that we have. We'd like to know if you're already implementing RTI and at what stage of implementation you might be, what guidance you have for implementation of RTI with ELLs. Sometimes there's an assumption that RTI as it is works well with everyone, but as you will hear today, there are specific things that we need to think about as that are specific to RTI with ELLs. And then finally, if you're using a specific model of implementation of the RTI model, whether you're using a standard RTI model or a problem-solving model, if you don't know, that's fine too. You'll learn more about it as you hear the presentations. And if you're using another system, that's fine too. So it looks like most everybody has answered now. It's good to see that, almost 50% have been using RTI for 2 to 4 years now. That's terrific. And some, a good substantial number, also 21%, more than 4 years. And then others of you are just beginning, and a very few of you have not started. But maybe this will give you the impetus to do so. Explicit guidance for implementation with ELLs. I guess we all have a lot of work to do there. And the models that are being used primarily is standard model. A lot of people are not sure, and you may get a better idea of what model you might already be using as you listen to our presentations. So thank you very much for filling out those polls. And let me turn over now to Dr. Esparza-Brown, who will be sharing with you her ideas on what kinds of guidelines to think about in developing a response to intervention model for English language learners. Dr. Esparza-Brown?
Great. Thank you for having me, and welcome. Good afternoon, everybody. Can you hear me? Just checking. I hope everybody can hear me. Yes. Okay, great. So to get started here, we're going to first talk what is response to intervention so that we have a common definition. So our response to intervention is a school-wide process, and it's everybody's responsibility. One of the biggest really components of RTI is that it's predicated upon effective intervention for all students in general education. We screen all students to identify those needing extra support, and we work in collaborative teams, determining what will work for each student. And it's a recursive process. What it is not is a path toward special education, the responsibility of any one person a one-size-fits-all approach, unidirectional, or evidence-based instruction and interventions for some. So those are what it is not. So now how, then, do we implement this? And how do we ensure that RTI is culturally and linguistically appropriate so it meets the needs of all learners? So what we see is a triangle that probably most of you have seen before, and I'll describe this for you then. The bottom part of the triangle, the base, in green, is a general education, or what we call Tier 1, or the universal component. And so this then means that we have appropriate, effective, and evidence-based core curriculum and instruction for all students. However, that is where the problem lies for English learners, because it is difficult to say that in every system all teachers adapt core instruction for the linguistic needs of all students and for the cultural and experiential backgrounds of students. So we'll be talking more about this. Another really important component is to understand that for English learners, English Language Development, or ESL, whatever we call that program, that it's provided and it's a core subject. This is not an intervention. I want to really repeat this and make sure we all understand that ESL, ELD services are not an intervention. For students that qualify for that program, that is a core subject for them and an entitlement, okay? So in Gen Ed, through universal screening, we then identify about the bottom 20% of students who are, their success is at the bottom 20% based on a universal screening measure given to all students. However, it's really important then to make sure, can you hear me better now? It's really important to make sure then that that 20% at the bottom are not all English learners. Because if we find that the struggling group are all EL students, then that takes us right back to saying there is a problem in core instruction, that it's not being modified then to meet the needs of English learners. So we should be disaggregating the groups, subgroups of students, and looking to see who are the bottom of those students. And again, if there's too many of any one subgroup, then we need to look back at core instruction. Now, some of those students, and we say about 15%, may move up to Tier 2. So Tier 2 is for students who are working not quite at grade level standards, and they need a double dose of intervention or instruction. So this is considered the strategic tier. And again, it must include an oracy component for English learners, meaning, again, we have to adjust and provide supplemental support for the language demands that are found in the intervention programs themselves, as well as considering building background knowledge when needed. Now, there will be some students, and we say perhaps 5% of students, who will not be able to, will not respond in the way that we would hope at Tier 2. So we move those students to Tier 3. That is the most intensive instruction. Once again, it has to include an oracy component for English learners. And these are for students who generally are working below grade level standards. So those, that's considered then the intensive level. Okay, so that's kind of the basic framework for RTI for English learners, and we'll be really digging into this over the next few slides. So once again, it's a multi-tiered support system. And typically, there are the 3 tiers that I've just described, but there are some systems that have a 4 or even a 5-tier support model, but I think across the country that the 3-tiered model is the most common. Now, Tier 1, as I mentioned before, is for core instruction, but in most core programs, that they're not necessarily developed to provide the appropriate language supports and cultural relevancy that English learners need to be successful. Hence, that's why I'm saying we need to make sure that we really at every tier, providing that oracy component, oracy meeting support for oral language. If we think of literacy as reading and writing and oracy, listening and speaking. Thus, all instruction for and intervention for English learners require inclusion of language support and culturally and experientially responsive pedagogy. And that includes core instruction. That goes into Tier 2, Tier 3, Tier 4. So that's where this framework differs, that we have to include these components at all, in all education and instructional practices with English learners. Now, Tier 2 is for children who are not meeting the expected benchmarks, but they're still working close to grade level standards. It's a small group intervention, and the focus is the specific areas targeted by the universal screening. And again, for English learners, these interventions must be appropriate for their language levels and cultural backgrounds. Now, you may be saying, well, but we use the intervention programs that our school has on the shelves or that they've purchased. Yes, typically, these intervention programs have not been researched on our students, and we will be talking more about that as we go along. Now, Tier 3, then, is typically for students working below grade level, and they are considered at high risk for failure. The small group instruction is given at this tier, smaller than in Tier 2, typically 1 to 3 students on targeted skills. And as in prior tiers, again, the instruction has to be adjusted for EL students' language levels and cultural experiential backgrounds. Now, let's talk about assessment within the RTI model, which is a critical component. So in Tier 1, or in Gen Ed, universal screening is typically conducted given to all students 3 times a year to identify those students requiring support to meet grade level standards, most frequently in literacy. But now we do have some models that are working in math and in writing, and as well as behavior. Now, these universal screening measures are brief assessments that are focused on target skills. So, for example, if we're targeting literacy, phonological awareness, phonemic awareness, phonics skills, now we target those skills that research has shown to be highly predictive of future reading outcomes. Now, referral for special education evaluation may occur at Tier 3, and I want to take the time to really talk about this for a moment. For English learners, we can make so many mistakes on determining who's struggling with learning because they're learning a second language from those who truly have a disability. So I highly recommend that for students that need Tier 3 intensive instruction, that at that point we go ahead and meet with parents and get permission for assessment and provide for them a comprehensive psychoeducational evaluation, because that gives us the data that helps us determine why those students may not have responded. RTI data is great for instruction, but we can't get down to the etiology then of why students may not be responding as we think that they should. And so from that comprehensive assessment, we can look at the processing skills to find strengths and weaknesses. Okay. Now, let's talk again about RTI for ELs, the general principles. So you've heard me say this through many slides, that language support must be provided throughout all instruction and intervention. And this means that students' language proficiency level in the instructional language guides the language intentionally taught and used throughout instruction. This means that students' cultural and experiential backgrounds are also considered to determine if it is necessary to provide background knowledge before the lesson. Now, Lynn and Thompson and Vaughn in 2007, and they have really done quite a bit of research on interventions for English learners, both English interventions and Spanish interventions. And what they tell us, again, is that their research has found that students made more progress when we include that oracy component that matches the language of intervention and matches the language of instruction. So again, oracy component, the oral language piece, and we make sure that if a student is receiving core instruction in English, that the intervention language is in English with English vocabulary and language structure support for instruction and intervention. Now, if children are in bilingual or dual language programs, then we would support the stronger language if that happens to be the home language of Spanish. Then the intervention would also be in Spanish and still include that oracy component because our students still need language development in either and both of their two languages. Again, the general principles, universal screenings are administered to all students, and the data must be disaggregated to ensure that English learners, that they're not represented in the group that we identify as needing the supports. Because once again, if most or all ELs in the class are at the bottom 20%, then the issue is likely to be inappropriate core instruction. Again, that would be core instruction that isn't adjusted for their linguistics and background needs. For English learners, again, ESL or ELD instruction is a core program, just as reading and math are for all students. So we've gone over that a bit, so I'm going to move on. Okay, so we're going to go into now some common questions that I get as I have traveled the country talking about these concepts. So are general outcome measures such as curriculum-based instruction valid for English learners? So the universal screeners and the progress monitoring tools that we've been talking about, yes, research does strongly suggest that they do identify English learners that need additional support to become good readers and are effective in monitoring their progress in acquiring those skills. So, there's often pushback, I think, from the bilingual field that, well, these measures don't identify our kids and they over-identify them and label them. Well, to remember, this is not about labeling students, but it is about identifying those students that might need some extra support in order to be a reader. So one of the common measures out there that's used is the DIBELS assessments and the Spanish version ELLs. Now, I commonly get asked, well, isn't this just a direct translation of DIBELS? Therefore, it's really not appropriate for our students that we're instructing in Spanish. Well, actually, I think perhaps at the beginning it was, but over time they have developed this ELL that it is not a direct translation, and it does take into account the linguistic structure of Spanish. I think where the pushback is that typically across the country we teach Spanish through a syllabic approach, and ELL and DIBELS does assess phonemic awareness down to the single sound level. But remember that eventually all students are going to be required, and we want them to be literate in English. And for that, they do need to be able to discriminate single sounds. So that's why it's included, that kind of a skill assessment in the ELL as well as the DIBELS. So that is, ELL is based on principles of how children learn in any alphabetic language. Now, some other common questions that I get is, how do I know what to instruct and assess at each grade level? Well, if you're using, so let's go back to what do we know about literacy? Well, we know that in 2000, the National Reading Panel found 5 foundational components of reading instruction. And here they are: phonemic awareness, alphabetic principle or phonics, vocabulary, fluency, and comprehension. And here, by the way, in blue is a link to the Common Core standards for literacy, just in case that's helpful. And so what you'll see on the right-hand side of this slide is in 2006, there was another panel that met, the National Literacy Panel. And they then looked at literacy for English learners, and they included that oral language component. So again, what I'm saying and recommending in terms of RTI and making sure that our instruction and interventions include that oracy component, fits right along with what the literacy panel found that we need for our students to be readers. So the skills measured by assessments like DIBELS and ELLs and aimsweb, which is another common measure, and its Spanish component, MIDE, that these are indicators to predict later reading success. So here are the names of the assessments from aimsweb. And here's an example of how then what's assessed across the grades. And these are measures of early reading skills, so they go up about to third grade generally. But DIBELS, I know now, has been developing models that go up into middle school. So kindergarten, you can see some early tests of literacy, grade 1. I'm not going to go over this, but they were just more for your reference. And you can see with DIBELS as well, at the beginning level in kindergarten, we're assessing initial sound. Getting into letter naming fluency, the end of kindergarten, first grade, word use fluency, nonsense word fluency, and then in the later grades, this oral reading fluency is really what's measured as the predictor for fluency, but also fluency links to comprehension. Okay, so what should be the focus of interventions for English learners? Well, Fidelity and Gerber found that interventions that incorporated at least 2 of those skills that we're assessing were more successful for English learners than interventions that focused on only 1 skill. So I think that we get more bang for our buck, so to speak, when we incorporate 2 skills, and remembering also that we always are including that oracy and foundational, knowledge background. We front load with those. What we've also found is that many of our students, as you know, come to us really requiring development of both first and second language. So what we find is that if we start listening comprehension instruction in kindergarten, that is really helpful and also leads to better reading behaviors, because there, through listening comprehension, we can start teaching the ideas of story structure, main idea, retelling, and summarizing. So that needs to start early. What's an effective group size and length for interventions? Well, Leibstedt, Richards, and Gerber found that for phonemic awareness instruction, for example, so the little ones, or the ones with beginning reading skills, a small group of 3 to 5 was the most successful, and also they were more successful the longer the interventions were in place, at least over 12 weeks. And I like to make sure to include this because I've been in education for almost 30 years, although I look very young. And what I remember on the old pre-referral committees that we would say, well, we're going to, put an intervention in place for 4 to 6 weeks. Then we're going to come back and discuss possible referral to special education. And what we're finding through research is 4 to 6 weeks really isn't enough time for students to gain the skills that we're looking. So we want to make sure to leave interventions in place for longer periods of time, at least 10 weeks, and sometimes a quarter, and maybe even more time. But we are going to find those students who are slow to respond, with even more weeks of interventions. So we want to keep track of the students who are the ones that are standing out from their true peers. Should phonemic awareness activities be withheld until children reach a certain level of English proficiency? So that's another question that I often get asked. And no, we want to say that interventions are most effective beginning with kindergarten to improve both phonemic awareness and word reading. So phonemic awareness activities are not predicated upon a certain threshold level of English. They should start right away. And again, that's really oracy. Should I be teaching to the test? Now, the reason that this is a common question is it goes back to what we were looking at as the components of DIBELS and aimsweb's assessments. And in particular, there's one subtest that we call nonsense word fluency. And I hear from many of my bilingual colleagues, it just doesn't make sense to test our students on this. And it's confusing to them, and that's why I don't think that DIBELS is appropriate for English learners. Well, remember, these assessments are not skills then that should be taught. And for example, this nonsense word fluency is really a measure of decoding abilities. So it's not a skill that the skill itself that's important, but it's the proxy for decoding abilities. And it's a very, very accurate assessment that helps us determine children's decoding skills. So they're not to be, we don't teach to the test, but we use these to help determine what skills children need more explicit instruction in. So what data should be used to make instructional decisions for English learners? Well, we can use, research is showing us, the same measures that we use for English-only students, because they do appear, as shown by research, that they predict as well for ELs, with some exceptions. So research on now, let's talk about Spanish reading measures. It is limited, but research does support the use of curriculum-based measures, and those measures would be ELLs, aimsweb, and there's a program, CORE, C-O-R, out of California that also it's really a book of paper pencil curriculum-based assessments, and many are in Spanish. Now, a recent study by Gutierrez and Vanderwood suggests that for young English learners, early screening measures may vary by the child's language proficiency level. So what the research is saying, at the beginning, when with young children, we may need to consider language proficiency of the children, but as I said earlier, not in general as we go up the grades. What data should be used to make instructional decisions for ELs? So based on our sample of second graders, this was Gutierrez and Vanderwood, it appears that English learners with early advanced and advanced levels of English proficiency read at a level that was similar to English proficient and native English-speaking students. So again, this is instruction in English, and proficiency does appear to be somewhat related to literacy skills, but not always. So English learners with lower skills tend to diverge from those of native English speakers, kind of based on their proficiency levels. Okay, I know I'm running out of time here. So this suggests that students at the lower proficiency levels may benefit more from phonological or phonemic awareness activities and vocabulary-focused support. So we may really, really need to look at that oracy component for these kids, but remembering that all of them need it. Okay, so how do I determine non-response? So when provided with specific explicit interventions in the skills that we find children are lacking, most English learners can outperform English-only students who receive only grade-level core instruction. So that's the good news. We really can provide explicit interventions to boost our students to make them academically competitive to English-only students. But there are going to be students that research shows who may not really be, may not improve a lot based on the interventions in Tier 1, 2, and even 3. And that's why I said for these students, we really would benefit from a full diagnostic or a special education evaluation that looks at skills, norm-based skills, as well as processing abilities. Now, isn't data from RTI progress monitoring enough to place a student in special education? And I see that I only have 1 minute left, so I'm going to reiterate that no, I really don't believe that that's enough data. And for English learners in particular, we cannot forget that the federal definition of learning disability talks about basic psychological processes that can be measured only through standardized assessments. So that's my lens of looking at ensuring equitable assessment and intervention and placement for English learner students. And I think that I have 1 minute left for 3. I'll move on until they yank me off. Unfortunately, and this is a quote from Richard's tutor, Solari, Leifstadt, Gerber, Filippini, and Aceves just last year, unfortunately, Many teachers are unsure of how to adapt curriculum to meet the individual needs of English learners and therefore look to special education for assistance. And please remember that placing English learners into special education programs simply because that's where they can get additional support, even though we don't think that they truly have a special education need, that is a violation of their civil rights. Okay, so I'm going to move real quickly into the two most common models of RTI. That's the standard treatment protocol and the problem-solving model. So the question is, which model is best for our students? Well, what we find is that, let me get here, you don't really fit in around here, Peggy. So trying to fit that square peg in a round hole, that's what I compare the standard protocol model to. A standard protocol model then is where often in schools and districts will give us menus of intervention programs that we could use with our students in Tier 1, Tier 2, Tier 3. We choose from those research-based programs. However, those research-based programs are not generally research on English learners. There are very few of those that have included English learners in their research base. Therefore, we know in general those intervention programs don't cover, they don't provide enough language support for the skills instruction. The same with background. So what we really want is this problem-solving model where we define a problem so it's individualized for students, analyze the problem particularly for that one student, develop a plan and evaluate the plan. And again, this can be a recursive process. Okay, and the problem-solving model appears to be the most appropriate for English learners if the focus is on understanding external or environmental factors that affect the child's opportunities to learn. So that's why this model is so important. We cannot forget to understand the context of an English learner and how that either is a barrier to learning or helps support learning. So I think I'm out of time.
Okay, thank you very much. This has been really, really interesting. And we now have 10 minutes to address some questions, and we've been collecting the questions. Dr. Rinaldi has also been doing a great job of answering some of the questions by text in the chat.
Yeah, right.
And so what we've tried to do is pull aside some of the ones that we've sort of grouped them into a couple different themes. And if we don't get through all of the themes, we will address them in writing after the webinar and provide that written response in the webinar archive.
Okay.
So the first set of questions is around Tier 3. And those questions are asking whether it's recommended that ELLs who are at Tier 3 automatically be evaluated for special education.
I hesitate to say automatically, but I would like to say that when children get to Tier 3, we're probably struggling to figure out, well, how can we help them learn? Because Tier 3 might be similar instructional approaches that we used in Tier 2, only with more intensity. Like we have decreased the size of the instructional group, we provide it more frequently and longer, and maybe more of the same may not be what they need. So I think a comprehensive evaluation then that focuses on using the most current models of intelligence that breaks intelligence down more between just a performance measure like the WISC would have 2 scales, is something that follows the new CHC model of intelligence, helps us then to see 7 broad abilities where children may have strengths and weaknesses. And those weaknesses then may help us identify why they would have trouble learning given a particular approach that we may have been using. So those assessments help with intervention planning, and then what also really help us identify those children who truly evidence what we would define as a disability.
And that was another question as well. How can when you're actually trying to distinguish between a learning disability and an English language development issue, how can you make that distinction and figure that out?
Mm-hmm. Well, again, I think it's through that comprehensive evaluation. So one of the components here that I am on the website, you'll find a resource that I created, and it's called a student profile. It's a place to collect data on the student. My recommendation is early on when we have concerns about students at Tier 1 that we really understand the child's context. So we collect information about their prior schooling experience and a good family interview, collecting information from the parents to try to understand, is this a problem that we only see at school, which can kind of lead us more to that difference, or do there seem to be issues that go across environments? Or is it just that the child hasn't had the experiential background to have progressed more? So it helps us make kind of these determinations of, well, that could have some issues of lack of access, but when we provide these intensive instructional opportunities, they're still not progressing to the level that other children are, then that will lead us to ask more questions. Then that comprehensive evaluation, again, helps us look at students' processing skills, hence meeting the definition of a learning disability, to determine those strengths and weaknesses. And the only way at getting at those processing abilities is through a cognitive assessment. RTI data alone will not get us that information.
Okay, great, thanks. We have lots and lots of questions coming in. I'm going to read one more that says, regarding the levels of English language proficiency and the differentiation that needs to happen to provide data that is particular to ELLs. How can you talk about when decisions are made, where do you include comparing to equal peers and the differentiation of goals according to English language proficiency?
Yeah, absolutely. In one of the earlier briefs that I wrote that was on the NCREST website, I defined what I call true peers, because we have to really help our teams to realize that you can't compare one English learner to another because their context could be so different. That's why filling out that student profile to really understand the child's context.
Hello?
Yes, and making comparisons. Can you hear me? Something happened.
You can continue. You can continue. We're set.
Okay, and making comparisons to students from the same language group, same place of birth, or the time and country. So we are, and same language proficiency levels. We are wanting to make comparisons apples to apples. So does that answer that question?
Yes, I think so, and you'll have a chance to look over these questions again and answer them in writing, so people will have another chance to review these. Another set of questions is around interventions, and there's a whole bunch of different ones, but one of them are do you have any recommendations for interventions targeting retail fluency, such as that measured by DIBELS?
Nothing comes to mind in particular right now. So my suggestion is, just doing a search on what's out there, in terms of a published program. So now what I want to reinforce right here, we know that most of the intervention programs that target these literacy skills are not really written for our students. So we're putting a reference up of an article that I co-authored where we have a framework that helps us to systematically consider the language and the content knowledge that's in any intervention program and how we front load or pull out those pieces so those are not barriers from students accessing the skill lesson. And so I think that slide will go up. So whatever is out there, most likely you're going to need to adapt it in using, good, really ESL strategies.
Okay, great. And so would that also answer the question that a number of people asked, which are they would like information about the best research-based practices to use with ELLs in teaching language arts?
Okay. Once again, I would refer them to that article that it is a Sanford, Brown, and Turner article 2012, because we have really consolidated the research in that article for effective instruction and intervention.
Great. Okay, and we're putting that up again. the citation for that article we're putting in the chat again. Now,
I want to make a couple of, can I just make a real quick comment? I was asking about making some comparisons from DIBELS results and comparing the ELLs with English learners. We're not really, this isn't a comparison in terms of what I want to say. Remember, I had recommended that we disaggregate the data so that we're comparing English learners' progress to other English learners' progress. And if we don't do that, then we are making improper comparisons that may be lumping together English learners as looking at they're not making progress when it may really be core. So again, yes, we need to disaggregate those groups so that we're making comparisons to like students.
Okay, great. Moving to a slightly different area, a number of people have asked about secondary school students, both in terms of figuring out how would you apply the research to intervention framework to the secondary school context.
Well, okay, that's a really broad question. So I think that they may be asking about for students, because we have many students who come in with that, they may not have had consistent instruction, the lack of opportunity, who may be struggling with the same kind of basic literacy skills that we teach in kindergarten and first grade. So we would need to use similar assessments because all students really need a solid base in phonemic awareness and in phonics. If they have gaps there, they might have trouble really being an independent reader. There is a new assessment out. It's called, I believe it's DIBELS Deep, that is targeting secondary students with that kind of a sketchy educational background so that we can identify those basic building blocks of reading, so then we target those and teach it to them, not necessarily with the same materials, because we don't want to be giving them books to teach phonemic awareness and phonics that have little ducks on a pond, for example, at the secondary level, but they may need the same skills.
Okay. Great, thank you. And I know we could go on and on with this question as well as with others, but we need to move on now. And we're now going to hear from Dr. Rinaldi, who has already been speaking with many of you through the chat. And she's going to speak with us now, providing some initial thoughts on implementation of RTI, looking specifically at two school-level examples.
Great, thank you.
Hello, everybody. So we now make a change from Julie. So Julie, thank you for everything that you shared with us, and feel free to answer to our participants while I speak as well. In this, it's a part of the webinar. What I'd like to do is, after going over the basic facts that Julie went, is to really think about how to implement this, how to get started if you are in the process of getting started, and we saw that number of people who are in the chat. And then the other part would be what you need to actually get the implementation aspect school-wide, and that was something that Julie referred to in one of her first slides. If you can hear me, please let us know in the chat. So how do we get started on a culturally and linguistically appropriate model? And so the first thing to think about is that there has to be a planning and exploration period that the school goes through to kind of think about what is it that is in place already that is effective and what is in place that is not effective. And then think about an installation place. What are the resources that we need to actually be able to apply the model? So one of the first things that I recommend that you will think about for school-wide implementation is to conduct a self-assessment or asset mapping of current structures that support your multi-tier system of support. Now, in this part of it, what I'd like you to think about is multi-tier systems of support as an organizing framework. So oftentimes we hear people talking about more initiatives. This should actually be a process of an organizing framework. And so I'll show you a couple tools of how to get that going. The second part of it would be to develop a multi-year implementation plan so that we know that every year there's an area that you're developing. You're not expected to be able to provide Tier 1, Tier 2, and Tier 3 the first month within the school starting. And then beginning with the implementation is thinking about how to understand your data and exactly how Julie talked about in terms of school-wide data and subgroups, and within that looking at ELD levels, special education status, and English learners with special education needs. So Julie again addressed the need for beginning with a universal screening of all of the students. And one of the most effective ways that I've seen schools use this model is to begin by also having something that I call data days, where it is a school-wide approach to looking at the data that Julie's been recommending as a school itself, as an entire school community, so that you can look at where the school wants to go and which subgroups are having difficulties and whether those subgroups are represented within larger percentages and we should be looking back at core instruction, or that it's just a few students who are, for example, ELD levels 1 and 2 that are having your most difficulty and therefore allowing you to be specific about what interventions you want to create. And then the last part that we see difficulty that I think people who are in the implementation phase could benefit from is some ideas on how to create a school-wide 4 to 6 week progress monitoring cycle, which is part of your RTI model. So I'll be talking a little bit specifically about that. So let's begin with how you begin with that self-assessment during that exploration and installation stage of implementing a multi-tier system of support. And so in this page, what you look at is at a tool that allows us to think about what do all students get, what do we have for all students, what do we have for some students, and what do we have for a few students. And we think about it within a couple of areas. You know, what assessments do we use? And every school district and every school has some assessments that they currently use. And so this is the time to think about whether those self-assessments are quick measures, like Julie shared, that are curriculum-based and that would give us good indicators of what to do for instruction. The next area is instruction, and so it allows us, again, to think about not only the curriculum materials, like what curriculum you're using in reading or mathematics, but also to think about what academic and social curriculum you're using, and in particular, what strategies. One of the things that I don't see very much during our technical assistance is strategies rather than package programs, and so I'll be sharing a little bit around those. And then the last part is what interventions. Again, you know, we look into closets in schools and they're full of programs. So, you know, the idea of thinking of this exploration place to, you know, have a team of the school level that is looking at to see what's in those closets or what is the training that some of your teachers have, whether it be Wilson training or Linda Woodbell training or Project Read training, or something less intensive like Great Leaps or strategy instruction. And then the last aspect is to think about scheduling options. Do we have, as a school, the ability to have different options in scheduling students and scheduling staff to be able to address the needs of the students that are going to be getting tiered intervention? So once you complete that, then you can begin thinking about which of those areas you want to deal with during a multi-year plan for implementation. You could also look and do a couple of these for the subgroups that we're talking about, such as English learners. And you could also break down this process through English learners at different levels of implementation. So for example, in year 1, you could think about how you're addressing the needs of SIFE students who are a larger group coming into your particular school, or for English learners who are levels 4s and 5s, which is the majority of your population, and how we can provide them with those 4 areas that I previously mentioned: assessment, instruction, and intervention. I'm going to just work on my speaker, see if it works a little bit better. Okay. We now move into looking at understanding your data and those data days and what happens during those. So again, I began by talking about how this should be a school-wide process, and so did Julie. Multi-tier system of support is a system. It is not a K-1 intervention of RTI in one classroom, but it is a school-wide approach. And when we mean school-wide, is that it should be either K-5, 6-8, 9-12, whatever your breakdown of your school is, but that means also every one of those faculty and support personnel are part of the process. The first recommendation is to think about that school-based leadership team, which all schools already have, either through an instructional leadership team or other kind of leadership team that they have, and think about what kind of data at that level, at the school-wide process, wants to look at. So if you're at the elementary level data, the questions may look at how many students are at grade level, how many students are 1 year behind or more than 1 year, how many ELLs, how many students in each ELD level are at grade level, below grade level, significantly below grade level, and how many of those are non-responders. So once we can identify questions to those answers, we can target then how we want to think about and structure interventions during the day. If we think about for secondary students, here are similar questions. You know, how many students are at grade level, how many are 2 years behind, how many students are reading at 4th to 5th grade reading level in the case of English language learners, and how many are, again, ELLs or ELLs with disabilities. So it's a matter of guiding questions that will guide you to think about how those particular populations are doing in your school. So moving on to those data days that I introduced in the beginning, and they serve different purposes. The first purpose is to develop goals, SMART goals, and I'll present that in a second. And the second goal is to ensure fidelity. What we know from the research is that if teachers are using and tracking the data as a team, they're better at developing instructional and interventions options for students. So looking at those data days as really promising practices, and many school districts are doing this even across schools to give more of a district-wide view, should be at least at the school level at least 3 times per year where the whole faculty gets together and they're able to look at your reading data, your math data, and your behavior data, if you're doing all kind of 3 aspects of it. Again, it should be school-wide, and you should use that data to develop some SMART goals, meaning, you know, specific, measurable, attainable, results-oriented, and time-bound. So the first year, and you'll see some examples in our next slide, you may find that 67% of your students are at grade level, K to 5 or 9 through 12, or however that's measured. And what we might find is that we want to be able to address, you know, to get to that 80% that Julie presented in that RTI figure. So what are we going to do to address that goal and be very specific as a faculty in a whole school about where we want to move all together? That ensures that culture is focused on response to intervention and MTSS, and it focuses on interventions really being delivered with fidelity across all the grades. The next part would be to talk about how you would monitor fidelity of delivery. So are you using a school-wide form that tracks that the intervention is actually delivered, or maybe the quality of that delivery may be the second step? But we don't only want to look at the school level, we also want to look at the classroom and individual level. So if we're looking at the school-wide data, we then allow teachers to break down by classroom level and be able to look at their own individual classrooms and grade. And some of the ways that you could do that is through that data day or through common planning time or professional learning community time, where we see in a lot of schools that are really unstructured. This will provide a very structured way to look at it, and you'll see some examples in the next slides. The purpose of these meetings is also to report barriers to implementation. So if we know a particular grade is having a difficulty delivering an intervention, that goes to the school-wide team that allows them to problem solve and help those teachers to really support the fidelity of implementation of those interventions. So these 2 levels of communication should be happening together to share the success and be able to provide interventions with high fidelity. And the last part would be to look at, I thought I had individual data here. So here's one example. So here in this example, you have a 4th grade grade level data analysis for English language arts. And what you'll see in this chart is that you're looking at universal screening in the fall, winter, or spring. So the fall is your yellow columns. The red is your winter columns. And your red is winter. And your blue columns are for the spring records. And so one of the interesting things that you begin to see when you track multiple areas, in this case fluency and comprehension, is that in some areas, this is a grade-wide sample, 4th grade, multiple classrooms, what you see is where students may be needing or what is happening during instruction. So it allows you to kind of think about, you know, what do we notice in change of students? Why did students needing a lot of supports increase from 32% to 57%? What are we not teaching in core instruction? Or we see a nice gain from 19 students being at grade level in comprehension in the fall to growing that number to 65%. And seeing whether we're meeting those SMART goals. So again, the purpose of looking at the grade level data or the school-wide level data is to be able to make some hypothesis of how we can provide instruction more strategically rather than continuing to do what we do on a daily basis without knowing the effectiveness of it. I created some questions for you to be able to guide you through what this chart talks about. But some of those questions for faculty would include who are those students who are ELLs within this grade level, and what are their ELD levels, and are they receiving ESL support as part of core instruction? So what we want to make sure is if you're not seeing gains, that we are delivering the core Tier 1 instruction that we said we were going to do, and that the services that are part of their core instruction are delivered, such as those of ESL instruction supports. Oh, here's an example of how the English language level development or English language development could be tracked. And this tool is also provided to you as an attachment with the materials of the webinar. I created this tool for one of the schools that we worked with, and this one was taken from some examples of the WIDA standards. And so all we did was really added the months across the year so that teachers can be progress monitoring monthly development of the student skills. Again, when teachers sit, we may recognize 2 or 3 things, but in a level list that is followed here monthly, we could really see how a student's growth is coming into their English language development. So let's talk about developing those weekly progress monitoring cycles. These are very difficult to schools to put together, and oftentimes they are done with little effectiveness. So here is an example of how a particular grade level can address the needs of 24 students that need Tier 2 or Tier 3 interventions. So the first thing would be to look at your universal data, and once you identify the students needing intervention, you put them in a list. In this case, my example has student A through student X. And once you identify, you could group those students and break it down by 4 students per week. With a very strict time protocol, you could probably get through 3 or 4 students each week, thereby creating a 6 to 8 week cycle with all your students where you could revisit every 4 to 6 weeks. I can answer more questions about this, but in general, what you're going to see in the next example is a protocol that allows teachers to be able to move through the conversation, so you could talk about those 4 students and verify that they are the plan that was intended for them, or the intervention, was actually delivered, what we call fidelity of implementation. So in this part, you see that there's a protocol where the teachers will follow, and there might be a particular instance where they talk about English language learners in one particular week or 2 particular weeks, depending on their percentage of students who are English language learners, or by level in your classrooms. But the idea would be that you literally go through what it is, the subject that you're dealing with. So what we find in meetings that are not highly structured like this, or using a protocol, is that teachers spend time talking about the same students. And so this cycles of progress monitoring, identifying early on who are the 4 students each week that we talk about, allows us to move through all the students getting interventions so nobody falls through the cracks. Again, if you look at that tool, and although it's a little bit difficult to see, you have access to it in the materials of the webinar. One of the things that you'll see is that we're tracking English language development, and you could use that previous form that I showed. But it also allows you to see that although we always review core instruction, are the students getting what we said we were going to get in terms of access to the regular curriculum? And again, this is critical for English language learners because the access to a regular curriculum is what gives them a rich vocabulary background to increase to their skills. And then it allows you to also think about whether what we said we were going to do was actually done. Was the intervention actually delivered? What we find oftentimes is that students want to deliver 3 times a week an intervention for 6 weeks, which would be the equivalent of 18 half-hour sessions of intervention. And when you don't track it, what we realize is they only got maybe 6 or 3 or however it was for whatever reason. So really thinking about how we have some data to show us that we are delivering the interventions and that they're truly either being really effective or really ineffective. At this point of the webinar, I'm going to jump into 2 case examples of actual schools that we've worked with. And there is one that is currently doing a shelter model. model and another one that does a dual language model. So I know there was a question about Spanish interventions, and you'll see how we help them as well. I'm going to go back one second and just talk about the picture in there for a second. And the picture really is a representation, public representation of where the grades are in terms of their data. So this is shared with parents at this level in this particular school. This one particular school, Garden Elementary, who's doing a problem-solving model, developed a way to reorganize their staff and identify tiered instruction explicitly for all staff. So the first thing they did was they had a focus that school year of professional development around RTI, and they had monthly sessions for the teachers that were data-driven, like those data days. Over the 6 years of implementation, the next thing they did was they hired dually certified personnel, so either general ed and ELL certification, or general ed and special ed, or special ed and ELL, and reallocated the support that these personnel can provide so that we are ensuring that core instruction is happening for English language learners and that we are cross-training each other to do effective interventions and strategies within the core instruction and Tier 2 and Tier 3. They reallocated the supports of personnel that are typical in schools, so they looked at how a reading specialist didn't have to serve K-5, or a dually certified person only worked with one type of population, to see how those skills of those professionals could really be used with a very specific intention. They provided 2 hours of common planning time with the RTI data-driven protocols, some samples of what I showed the previous slides ago. And they monitor data weekly at the grade level, monthly at the school level, and presented data walls for 3 times a year to the school community. In part of that, they also created the SMART goals I suggested. Within a 6-year period, and remember we had you begin by thinking about a multi-year implementation plan, they began with English language arts. They moved into positive behavior interventions and supports, PBIS, which is the social side of multi-tier systems of support. And then they added the third dimension of mathematics. So they've been exploring the way of changing how they work within this framework, not changing the curriculum or the materials or the interventions that they do. They're really thinking about how they work differently to provide these levels of supports for students in every subject. The first thing they did was recalibrate Tier 1. What I mean with recalibrate Tier 1 is really looking at what teachers were doing during core instruction, during the regular education, general ed classroom. And one of the things that they found was that people were doing different things. Everybody did guided reading differently, or everybody taught a novel the same way or not the same way, and so we were building gaps in the students. So they came during common planning time to agree as to what of those 5 areas and 6 areas of literacy, including those for the oral language that Julie presented, how those were being addressed and what the percentage of time they spent on each of those by the level of the population in their classroom. So if you had 80% of your kids that were English language learners, there was more emphasis on vocabulary, instruction, and oral language and listening comprehension. Whereas if you were in a school that only had maybe 10% or under 10% of ELLs, they tried to provide that support very differently. But the idea was to ensure that we were looking at all those areas of literacy through the different curriculum that they had. So if you had, for example, Reading Street, that Reading Street was addressing phonemic awareness, fluency, decoding, comprehension, vocabulary, and oral language development. They also developed a block scheduling so that they could move supports during the reading time, and so that there were always 2 teachers present in each classroom during reading instruction or during part of that reading instruction time when interventions would be delivered. For Tier 2, they identified what they had existing using that asset map that I presented at the beginning and looking at what interventions and training their teachers had in those interventions. And so they picked programs that looked at how much time was required for the intervention, looking always at the most efficient and the ones that could give you the most for the least amount of time. Great Leaps was one that they used. Foundations was another one. Language Basics was something that they started trying, but they also found that package programs were not enough for English language learners, and so they focused on vocabulary and literacy interventions that they created themselves through the support and collaboration of the ESL teacher and the regular education teacher. As part of that, they used peer-mediated instruction, and I'll give you some examples of that in the next couple slides. But really what they're trying to do is to think about interventions beyond programs, package programs, but think about interventions as strategy instruction. What strategies that we could use year to year to provide students with the strategies that they need that we know good readers could use or good math takers could use. And then they also looked at what tools they had for progress monitoring and whether they were enough for all grades. Oftentimes what I see is that districts purchase for schools, aimsweb for K in first grade and nothing for second through fifth. So how can they solve that problem is a question based on that asset map that you began. For Tier 3, they identified evidence-based interventions and strategies, again, thinking about what would be appropriate for the particular population. So in this case is the problem-solving model because all students did not get the same intervention. So for example, if you think about Wilson reading, which is a very popular intervention, we don't know how that's going to progress for English language learners because there's no research on that. So it's really thinking about and measuring every 4 to 6 weeks whether that's an effective program for that particular population at that English language level or it wasn't, and exploring what other options there are. Again, we had the teachers think about peer-assisted learning strategies and how that could be done on a one-to-one basis with the teacher. We also look at other programs and curriculums and seeing how those could supplement in this intensity of level. So here are some learning lessons that school went through after implementation, and so that were particular to English language learners. So in kindergarten, there were no difference between the non-English language learners and the ELLs in risk status according to letter naming fluency of DIBELS. But in first grade, the ELL significantly dropped when the stakes go up for letter naming fluency and oral reading fluency. So the lesson there was thinking about what supports the first grade teachers need right around before the middle of the year that would help to provide more experiences for those first graders to deal with connected text rather than waiting for them to kind of drop below during that middle of the year assessment. And the same thing happened during the fourth grade as well. So again, if you break down the school-wide data to grade level data and individual data, you're really able to be strategic about where supports in the school can move to, such as your trained paraprofessionals or volunteers that are trained in particular programs, or strategies, or how you can use those professionals to sit with the kids that could do independent reading and you could be working with those students. The outcome was really strategic planning and reallocation of resources and evidence-based practices. One of the teachers in this particular programs, after we ran focus groups, said that the RTI has helped teams, and notice the word teams. The students became all of theirs. They didn't have 20 kids or 25 kids. They had 75 kids that they were supporting. So they really further supported all students and especially English language learners. This begins the second case study on a dual language program, which I think some of you were interested about Spanish interventions and how those could be used. And this, again, could be used during the introduction of a SIVE student that has some language, or it could also be introduced in a sheltered English program that does allow for some transitional bilingual education options. So this particular dual language school started by planning and enriching core instruction. So they really created a living document of the foundational skills or activity bank in both languages and by area reading skill. Those reading skills that Julie talked about from the National Literacy Panel and the National Reading Panel. And so they developed 6 critical literacy areas for whole group and small group instruction, and everybody agreed to develop that, and they called it a daily reading diet. So what was their daily reading diet? Meeting those 6 critical literacy areas and created activities based on the materials that they have to be able to fund that core instruction of the whole group and small group during centers. The other thing that they noticed as a dual language school was that they had limited engagement in oral language practice. So just as for the ELLs, that oral CPs is key, as Julie said, in the dual language programs, it was key as well because the non-dominant language is not a language that is commonly used by the kids. So in thinking about how to support that oral language fluency and the idea of addressing at least 2 of those areas recommended by the National Literacy Panel, we picked an intervention called peer-assisted learning strategies. It's peer-mediated learning with corrective and reciprocal teaching. This has been validated and was developed by the Fuchs at Vanderbilt University, and it is a strategy. It is not a packaged program. And it addresses oral language development, fluency, and reading comprehension, and it could be done kindergarten through 12th grade. Obviously, the materials for the high school level look a little bit different than what I put here in this slide, which shows some of the materials that it comes with. So there is a training module that Vanderbilt has that will be shared with you as part of the materials of the webinar that goes through a K-2, 2 to 6, and then high school level. So it's a structural, PALS is a structured instructional strategy in which students are paired very specifically and very discreetly so that they can practice on reading fluency, oral language, and comprehension. This is a strategy that could be used time after time, grade after grade, and that once the students learn it, it's highly engaging, and it takes the teacher away from the front of the classroom. As teachers, we tend to do too much talking and not allow the students to really do that talking, so we want to be able to have something that really allows them to practice that oral language skill, particularly for any level of English language student that needs that practice with that and that chance to take that during those oral language exchanges. The strategy uses three reading skills that addresses three specific reading skills. One is called partner reading and retelling. The second one is paragraph shrinking, and the third one is prediction relay. So the idea is to think about how we pair students strategically by English language level, special education status, and you could be doing this as a supplement to the Tier 1 instruction with all students. So you're also talking about benefiting all students because it is differentiated by reading level. And there's a particular way to do this. So I urge you to go back and think about looking at the manual, because the purpose of this webinar is not to teach you how to do it, but to teach you about the benefits of it. And the second part of that I present here is the ability to have a way to check whether you're doing it right or wrong, and so that your teachers are not just pairing students and letting them read right next to each other without actually doing the strategy. So using data Tier 2 interventions in this particular dual language program, they again analyzed fall and winter data to identify ELLs needing additional and supplemental support. And at K2, they decided to focus on vocabulary and phonemic segmentation, exactly what Julie recommended. Grade 1, phonics and vocabulary. Grade 2 and 3, fluency practice, vocabulary, comprehension. And they're doing the same thing in their 4th year of implementation with grades 4th and 5. The data has been enormous in looking at the growth in both languages. And so what I show here is dual language K-3 dominant language. So they're looking at Spanish and English as dominant languages in this dual language program. So this includes English and Spanish fluency scores of a little bit less than 350 students. And again, what you see is the change, the growth of the number of students in fall, winter, and spring from 70 to 77%. That's attainable, is doable, and they were able to provide it as not even a Tier 2, but a Tier 1 supplemental instruction for all students. All students got this intervention. And that in itself helped the students to increase their reading levels as well. And then the arrows also show a decrease in the needs of Tier 2 and Tier 3 interventions over the years. So from 18 to 17% for those needing Tier 2 supports, and from 12 to 8% those students needing Tier 3 supports. Again, if we look, this is another view of the reading comprehension data. So in this particular school, they were very careful about not only following fluency data, because there's a lot of question about the two languages, but they also wanted to follow reading comprehension data. And again, you see a similar trend of increase of the number of students being at grade level or Tier 1, and the decrease of the number of students needing additional Tier 2 or Tier 3 support. Again, I asked a couple questions on the side. Is fluency and comprehension aligned in both dominant and non-dominant languages? Who are the students responding to Tier 2 and Tier 3? Are there particular English language levels or Spanish language levels? Which ELD level in the non-dominant language are responding to the intervention? So again, it's all about asking the right questions. So last year, what the data told them was there's good growth in reading comprehension in both English and Spanish dominant languages, limited growth in fluency in both Spanish and English. students were not engaging in oral language practice in Spanish, where the data shows less growth in fluency. So they were able to really pinpoint where they need to move next and how to tweak the intervention to meet the needs of their students. They needed to identify an intervention to improve fluency in oral language, and ultimately they decided to approach PALS during that year. The next slides really just provide you with other examples of where these interventions are presented and other resources that address the 6 areas of literacy instruction. So I urge you to look at those. For particularly the secondary level, the website by Margarita Calderon happens to have very good strategies about what they call tier words. And so I'll let you kind of go and explore that, but it does provide some great guidance. And again, for peers, assisted learning strategy for PALS, I'm providing you the review described by the What Works Clearinghouse, as well as the Vanderbilt module where the training materials are provided and the correction sheets for the kids are available for printing in Spanish and in English. They actually have the module in Spanish and in English as well. So for those of you who are asking for Spanish, there you have it. And then lastly, I urge you to visit these 3 centers around the country, the National Center for Response to Intervention, if you're curious about more interventions, the Intensive Intervention Center, and the National Center for Learning Disabilities and the RTI Action Network, where you can really ask any of these questions that you're asking in the webinar through their website as well. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much, Claudia. That is so much information there, and in particular those resources at the end. As we've said before, we will, actually the slides are available for you to download, and so you can access all of the resources that she had on those last few slides on the document there. So we do have some time for questions, and we're coming to the end, but we'd like to give our participants a little bit of time to ask some questions, and we have a few here. One of them, Claudia, is about assessments of reading comprehension. An interest in having some assessments that go beyond word ID, decoding, and fluency, and looking more at reading comprehension. Are there any ones that are valid measures for ELLs?
So that's a great question. So one of the things to think about is what you could do 3 times a year versus what you could do on a weekly or monthly basis for progress monitoring. So I would say that the diagnostic tests such as the developmental reading assessment or the Fountas-Pinnell's test of comprehensions, which are typically used in schools and elementary schools, could be a good resource to begin with. But rather than doing it in the fall and then again in the spring, use it as an instructional piece and do it 3 times a year. I know that requires more time, but again, if you're doing this as a school-wide approach, you can structure the scheduling of those assessments so that there is time to do it, and I know of many schools that are doing that.
Okay, great. Thank you. And then there were a number of questions around ELLs who either are not being considered for administration for special education because their challenges are around issues of attendance, and these are students who probably will never test out of ELL if they don't receive the extra support, the additional support in special education. And what can you recommend around that?
That's a really tough question. I think what I recommend is thinking about how you could increase engagement in your school, how you could kind of rev up the desire to come to school. Now, sometimes when these things are beyond the control of the student, the one way to think about is how can you engage the parents? One thing that you could do is create some of these this kind of strategies of reading of reading at home so that it becomes a fun activity rather than something that they dread, whether it's in Spanish or in English or in their language, their primary language. So I think the key here is to think about how you engage parents so that they want to come, and really getting to know through the support of your case managers, case workers, guidance counselors, or whoever is able to visit the school, how you can get these kids engaged. Now, when the students are engaged, they want to come to school despite of what parents tell them. So I would say make it fun, and that's one of the other aspects of PALS that I love is the ability to really make it very engaging for the students.
Okay, great. Thank you. And there are a number of other questions here. I just want to interject that a number of people have been asking about how to access some of the documents that that Dr. Esparza-Brown has been talking about in the chat. And if you look to the right of the chat, there is a box that says download today's files, and everything that we've been referring to is there. And so feel free to download those files from there. And I think we have time for one more question, and this is a sort of specific question about the case studies that you were describing, with some interest in knowing more about the school demographics in each of those. So we just have about 1 minute left, so if you can summarize quickly, that would be great.
You know, I had to cut that slide out on both of them because they told me to. Most of the schools had between 70 and 80% who were English language learners, actually who were Hispanic background, and about 40 to 50% of them were English language learners. The rest were minority African American, and then just about 7% white. So this was in urban schools.
Okay, great. Thank you very much. Thankfully, as I said earlier, both Dr. Esparza-Brown and Dr. Rinaldi have done a great job of helping to answer the questions in the chat box while the other was presenting. And so I think we've gotten through many of our questions. Those that were not answered, or those perhaps we want to answer in more detail, will have a written responses available on our webinar archives. But before we end, you'll see that we just had pop up there a final poll that we hope you'll answer. And this is a poll to ask about the challenges that you're facing in implementing RTI. So go ahead and please check as many as apply. And this really helps us as we're thinking about the kinds of issues that are most important for us to address here at the REL. So I can see people are completing that now, and so that's great. Thank you very much, and we'll give you a few more minutes. I know a lot of people have had to leave the chat, but leave the webinar, but we'll continue until we see the answers slowing down. And then as you finish the poll, the only last thing is that I want to thank both of our speakers and our participants. This has been a great webinar, and we do have a survey that we would like you to complete, and you can see in the chat box there. The link is there, and we ask that you please complete that survey before you leave. And so before we leave, let's just take a look quickly at the results of this poll. The biggest challenges, it looks like the one that's been highlighted the most is that instruction is not tailored to ELLs language levels and cultural backgrounds, which is exactly what we've been talking about today. And hopefully both of our presenters have provided you with some resources to go and to try and address that in your schools and districts. So again, and I see a question here about accessing the poll results, and I think, is that being answered by somebody here? So I'm not sure whether those poll results can be accessed. You guys can see the results, right? We will archive the whole thing, and so yes, those results will be part of the final archive. I'm sorry for the confusion of that, but thank you very much for your participation, and thank you particularly to Dr. Esparza-Brown and Dr. Rinaldi for a great presentation, and have a great afternoon, everybody.
Thank you.
Bye. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.
Thank you very much, Carrie, and thanks for all the many participants who participated today. There is that survey if you haven't had a chance to fill it out. The link is in the chat box and also below there in the feedback box. Have a great evening, everybody, and thank you for joining the REL Northeastern Islands for this bridge webinar. Have a great night. Bye-bye.